Awesome. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's conversation on alternative models of safety and justice that responds to the need of both domestic violence survivors and responsible parties in Black and Brown communities, and particularly the role of faith-based organizations and faith-inspired programs in filling the void left by traditional models. Today's discussion is the last in a four-part series that address race, religion, and economic inequality in a domestic violence context. This series is brought to you by the Interfaith Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence in honor of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. My name is Tschika McBean, and I'll be the moderator for today's very timely conversation. I now invite Dorian Karp, Senior Advocacy and Policy Manager at Jewish Women International, to talk briefly about the Interfaith Coalition. Go ahead, Dorian.
Great, thank you so much. Hello again, everyone, and welcome to the fourth and final session of the Interfaith Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence's four-part series for Domestic Violence Awareness Month. This discussion is being recorded, and it will be emailed to everyone who registered for the series. Before I turn the discussion back over it to the moderator and IC member, Tschika McBean, I want to introduce myself and the Interfaith Coalition. My name, as Tschika said, is Dorian Karp, and I'm the Senior Advocacy and Policy Manager at Jewish Women International. Today, I would like to acknowledge that I'm working from my home outside of Washington, D.C., a home which sits on the traditional lands of the Nacotchtank and Piscataway people, past and present. Acknowledging the land we each sit on is one way to continue honoring Indigenous peoples going forward, and I encourage other faith organizations and leaders to do the same. I'll add the resources I use to find that information into the chat. JWI's focus and mission is to empower women and girls and end gender-based violence. We do this work in secular, interfaith, and Jewish spaces. JWI first convened the Interfaith Coalition in 2007, and now it represents 40 faith-based organizations who come together to work to end violence against women and girls, with a focus mainly on impacting and effectuating change through federal legislative advocacy. This month, we hosted this four-part series to look at the intersection of race, religion, and domestic violence. And thank you for entering this space today. Tschika.
Thank you very much, Dorian. To begin, to frame our discussion, I will quickly outline how traditional models of safety and justice have affected Black and Brown communities. In my past roles, in my work roles, I have worked as a domestic violence caseworker, acted as an investigator, prosecutor, and defense attorney in child welfare cases, and worked on many legal issues pertaining to returning citizens. This topic today is incredibly refreshing because it speaks to the unique role of faith-inspired programs and faith communities in securing safety and justice for some of the most vulnerable members of our society. When we say traditional models of justice, we mean the systems used to penalize sexual and violent misconduct in intimate relationships, such as policing, the prison system, the criminal justice system. And when we say traditional systems of safety, we mean domestic violence shelter, domestic violence accountability programs, and existing advocacy efforts outside of faith-based communities. To provide a very brief background to set the foundation, in the 1970s, the catalyst for creating these traditional models was a belief that if society criminalized domestic and sexual violence, the problem may be significantly reduced or disappear forever. And let us be reminded that as recent as 1970, the state of affairs for survivors was very challenging. For example, in sexual violence cases, the prosecutor had to produce eyewitness testimony for crimes typically done in seclusion. There were no rape shield laws. There was no statute recognizing marital rape. There were very few indictments, and domestic violence cases was not a priority. And so survivors and responsible parties were not fully healed when they engaged in these services. And so there was a call for change. But as we now know, the laws and policies that were enacted did not curb the behavior of the responsible parties, and utilizing policies such as mandatory arrest in domestic violence cases further deteriorated the safety of survivors, especially those in Black and Brown communities. For example, analysis from the data from the National Center of Health Statistics between 1987 and 2005 showed that mandatory arrest laws were not an effective domestic violence prevention method. And further, an analysis of FBI data found that mandatory arrest laws increase intimate partner homicides. Further, analysis and research have also shown that in jurisdictions with mandatory arrests for domestic violence, the arrest rates of women of color are higher than those without, which resulted in a very disproportionate number of Black and Brown women in prison. Many of the traditional programs that were created failed in some parts Black and Brown communities because Black victims experienced systemic racism and oppression, which prevented them from accessing these services, disclosing their abusers, and further utilizing culture-blind approaches in developing and administering these interventions did not really serve Black and Brown victims. And just pulling from the research I'd done in preparation for this conversation, I found this very interesting quote whereby a Black woman mentioning her hesitation to engage in these services said that, Black women have been asked by the police, for example, if you were slapped, where is the mark on your face? But, Black women don't bruise like Caucasian women. So that question itself would cause a hesitation to engage in these services. Women are scared to call, Black and Brown women are scared to call the police because they fear their abusers might be murdered as opposed to being taken away from that violent situation. And there are many conclusions, which I'm going to try to post these research in the chat for you to further read up on these statistics that shows that poor women of color are often reluctant to call the police because they also fear losing custody of their children. They may face deportation and be accused of lying. There's so many hesitations towards engaging in these services. And finally, in 2016, the Child Welfare Bureau of the United States Department of Health and Human Services issued of African Americans and Native Americans in child welfare systems throughout the entire country. So these are just a few statistics I want to ground the conversation in. And thinking in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, it has revealed to those unfamiliar with experiencing systemic oppression that there are many cracks in our systems. And Black and Brown communities are disproportionately the ones that fall through these cracks. And so creating new systems of justice and safety requires a completely different approach. And after today's discussion, I hope we leave with the added knowledge that applying spiritual principles such as forgiveness, cooperation, accountability, generosity, equality, hope, compassion is a worthwhile endeavor, and exploring transformative justice models where spiritual principles are being institutionalized can offer insights to avenues for transformative justice and safety for survivors and responsible parties of domestic violence. Now, let's get to the meat of our conversation. And I want to invite the discussants today who will present the work that they're engaged in. I want to introduce Ramelia Williams, Director of the Ministry Initiatives for Love, Mercy, Do Justice at the Evangelical Covenant Church. And she will present her work on the Mending Soul curriculum. And I also want to introduce Solitair, Sheldon Solitair Pitt, who is a Juno-nominated artist, producer, and songwriter, and also the chair of the FYou Forgiveness Project and program manager of the FYou Jail Project. And he'll present his work in that regard. And to begin, I will invite Ms. Ramelia Williams to briefly talk about her program, the structure, the work that her organization is doing, and the highlights of the program. So I want to invite Ms. Williams to engage in this conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tschika. Thank you to the Interfaith Coalition and as well as yourself as the moderator for inviting my voice to this conversation today. And thank you for those who have joined us who desire to have a hand in this work. So as we think about our alternative systems for safety for victims and survivors of abuse, I think it's really important from a faith perspective for religious leaders to think a little bit about what their own theology of forgiveness is. And so I will present today an alternative forgiveness model than one we have traditionally talked about in our faith communities. So I will speak today from a Christian perspective and from a biblical purview, but I will present principles that are very translatable no matter what faith tradition we are a part of. So the forgiveness model that I'm sharing, looks like my screen will not allow this to be seen. So this forgiveness model that I will share today comes very directly from a book called Mending the Soul, which is written by Stephen Tracy. And I will drop the name of that book in the chat, Mending the Soul by Stephen Tracy. So from a biblical perspective, we have very historical traditions that partially apply forgiveness concepts to a theology of abuse. So we think about in the book of Matthew, the 18th chapter, where it says, forgive 70 times, 7 times. We have models that teach us to pray, to forgive, and then to reconcile with the abuser or the harm doer. We have forgiveness models that tell us that divorce is absolutely not a moral option for problems in your marriage, including situations where abuse is involved. We've been taught that to forgive means to simply let go. You need to let go of the fear, the anger, the suspicion, and the mistrust. And then we're also taught that forgiveness means that we clear the offense from our memory and we act as if no wrong thing was done to us, and we just move on with our lives. But forgiveness is very much more complex than that. And there are very multi-layered, multifaceted layers to forgiveness that include negative consequences and also time to rebuild broken trust. And we really miss the depth of transformation that can grow out of forgiveness when we distill it down to just, you should forgive and forget. And so this model from the Mending the Soul curriculum presents 3 different types of biblical forgiveness. And so as I'm speaking, you can think about a triangle, and at the top of the triangle is God. And then down here on one end of the triangle is the abuser. On the other end of the triangle is the abused. And so when you think about the axis of the axis, I think I'm making up words. If you think about the axis of the triangle, the axis that moves between the abuser and God is judicial forgiveness. And then this axis that moves from the abused to God is psychological forgiveness. And then the foundation on the bottom that moves from abuser to abused is relational forgiveness. And so just keep that picture in mind for those of us who are visual, and I'll move through these 3 different types of forgiveness. So judicial forgiveness that moves from God to the abuser is judicial forgiveness is a forgiveness that only God can give. God offers pardon for wrongdoing when you do wrong to an individual, a community of people, or to God's earth. God desires to forgive and to heal the worst of the worst depraved individuals. This judicial forgiveness is a removal of guilt for your wrongdoing. But this judicial forgiveness is contingent on confession, acknowledging the wrong you did, and being remorseful to the point you declare that you will not repeat the offense. And we hinder this forgiveness when we victim blame and victim shame, and we don't call the harm doer to be accountable for their actions. And so this might look like protecting the favored religious leader in the community who has abused the vulnerable in their care. So that's judicial forgiveness. And then psychological forgiveness moves between God and the abused. And it's a two-part forgiveness. The first part of that is this idea that we let go of the hatred and a personal drive towards revenge. And I quote, Stephen Tracy wrote, "Letting go of resentment toward an unrepentant abuser feels like letting go of justice and letting the abuser win. But anger in the case of," end quote, "but anger in the case of abuse is righteous anger. It's a very normal response to a very atypical situation that happened to you. And so this evil should anger you because it also angers God. And so the key here is to not allow that anger to lead you toward harboring a desire for revenge. Forgiveness in this case can be imaged as letting go of rage to let God execute justice whenever and whatever that looks like in God's realm. And then I quote Stephen Tracy. He said, "Forgiveness is letting go of my right to hurt another person because they hurt me." And then the second part of the psychological forgiveness is forgiveness in this case, the second part of this is extending grace to the offender. And Stephen Tracy writes, "The willingness to extend grace and goodness to those who have hurt us. And this is a grace that we extend by faith, with hope and prayer that the harm doer will find healing and transformation." And then the third part of the equation, from abuser to abuse, is relational forgiveness. And this forgiveness involves a restoration of relationship, what in some of our faith traditions we might call reconciliation. And the reality is, and why this is an alternative model for forgiveness, is that this part of the forgiveness equation may or may not be possible. So it depends on the harm doer's commitment to walking the painful road of shame, condemnation not of who they are, but condemnation of what they have done, and a repentance for their wrongdoing. Luke 17 says, "If your brother sins, rebuke him, and if," an emphasis on if, "and if he repents, forgive him." And in the Greek translation, this repent can be translated into two words, change mind. And it gives a connotation of changing one's life and behavior. And we need to ask how this changed behavior is evidenced in the life of the reformed abuser. An apology is not the same as a changed life and changed behavior. This takes time, it takes prayer, it takes counsel and true repentance to come to the place of being a reformed, repentant abuser. And then repentance is, it's hard to measure, but there are some, I'll give us 4 key indicators. One, the harm doer names the wrong that was done. They acknowledge the pain and the damage that wrong caused. They establish boundaries that will decrease the likelihood of more abuse. And they demonstrate changed behaviors that lead to they demonstrate changed behaviors that led to abuse that previously occurred. So abuse victim survivors can offer forgiveness in ways that do not depend on restored relationship. So I believe thematically, the forgive and forget model of forgiveness in our faith institutions has many times put abuse victims and survivors in harm's way again. And so this is an alternative model of forgiveness that I think offers a new way of moving towards forgiveness and setting up boundaries for safety for abuse victim survivors. I'll turn it back to you, Tschika.
Thank you very much, Ramelia. We're now handed off to Mr. Solitair Pitt to discuss the work that he's doing with the forgiveness model in Toronto, the FYou project. Solitair, I welcome you to the discussion.
Solitair, you are still muted. And unfortunately, we can't hear you.
Got it. Good now. All right, perfect. Yes, once again, I was just saying thank you very much. I'm very honored to be a part of this conversation. My name is, yes, Sheldon Pitt. That's my government name, born and raised in Toronto, Canada. I'm not sure where all the attendees are from, but you know, I hope you're staying positive and testing negative out there. Yes, so I am also a hip hop artist. I go by the name of Solitair. I do music production, songwriting. I've been nominated for a couple of Juno Awards, the Canadian equivalent to the Grammys. And I own a recording studio and a music school where I work on artist development and consultation services for artists and producers. I've been doing that for the better part of 25 years. Now, in line with that is what I believe a responsibility of being a leader in my community, which is contributing to mentorship programs or supporting youth. And I've been doing that in partnership with a number of organizations for pretty much the same amount of time, which is what led me to my work with FYou, the Forgiveness Project. And I had expressed a little bit of apprehension at participating, mainly because this was explained to me as being an interfaith, you know, panel discussion. And I have grown up as a Catholic. My family is Catholic, but I think my perspective is outside of that, even though we do have, you know, our founder is a Christian. She's actually a certified chaplain. Her name is Tara Muldoon. She's the one who founded the organization FYou, the Forgiveness Project, after having been a victim of abuse and assault herself, and found the path to her mental health and being able to get past that circumstances through this philosophy of forgiveness. And she's been, this year, actually in December, we're celebrating our 10-year anniversary since its inception. And what initially started off as a place to provide, you know, a safe spot for fellow abuse victims to, you know, to commiserate about their stories and support each other through their journey of being able to, you know, to overcome this trauma, has grown into a multifaceted program that encompasses the work that I do as the jail program coordinator for programs for young men in custody. So there is a correlation, I think, to this discussion as it pertains to, you know, domestic and sexual violence, because a lot of the young men that we work with in custody, specifically talking about jail, but, you know, in general, as far as the communities that we service to, it's not just young men, and it's also, you know, just young people or BIPOC communities, marginalized communities. We work with a whole range of individuals who have suffered from, you know, growing up in poverty or being victims of violence, or growing up in violent neighborhoods, having survived family members being murdered or whatnot, and being left to kind of deal with the trauma outside of that. And we also work with specifically with young men in custody, working through a lot of the guilt associated with the crimes that they committed in serving the time. So I feel like, you know, after having been reassured by her that the work is still, you know, is still relevant, what we're doing to this conversation, I think that I appreciate first and foremost my fellow panelists who discussed the philosophy, the various aspects of forgiveness, because I feel like for myself, it has really been an eye-opening journey the more we have conversations about forgiveness, the type of forgiveness, and how many ways that it can help people to take ownership after being victims, particularly when you're talking about sexual violence, physical abuse, verbal abuse, or whatever circumstances that you're dealing with. Forgiveness, when you're looking at it from the perspective of, you know, how it can help you to cope. We call our program FYou. It's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek phrase, which obviously does not stand for the vulgar FYou, but more stands for forgive you, which means it's twofold, which is forgive you and then forgive yourself. And I think forgiveness of self is a powerful concept, because it allows you to take ownership of making a mistake in the circumstances where you were doing the best you can with the circumstances and the knowledge you had at the time, and that everybody has an opportunity to grow. We all make mistakes. And in order for us to be able to reconcile and be accountable for that, there has to be space in society for us to recognize the imperfections that we each have based on our circumstances, so that they can, be accountable and grow from it and have an opportunity to prove themselves to be a productive member of society. So that's the philosophy that we approach when we talk to people, individuals in jail. Just to give you just like a little bit more of a rundown about us as an organization, because like I said, I focus on the jail program aspect, but there's several other branches to what we do. We're a nonprofit outreach. We work with youth and young adults around the themes of forgiveness, number one, restorative justice, number two, and conflict management. As you can imagine, a lot of these young people in Toronto, a lot of the young people that we're involved with happen to be gang identified or are facing, charges for violent offenses. So this idea of being accountable for their crimes is one thing, but the problem that we encounter in terms of the approach of the criminal justice system is to punish and make these people be held accountable for the damage that they've done to society. They serve their time, and then what ends up happening is they end up going back into the very same circumstances that they're in. So us as a society, the perception that we have of criminals is that they're defined by the crime that they've committed, as opposed to the whole scope of their existences. Now, when we talk about this idea, particularly how it affects marginalized communities, BIPOC communities, Black and Brown communities, it's a lot of times the narrative around young Black men who are arrested for violent crimes is they've committed a serious crime, they're a danger to society, they're unruly, and they're not, they need to be locked away and locked up and throw away the key. Whereas when you're talking about, white communities or more affluent communities, the narrative becomes one of, well, this is a young person, they have their whole lives ahead of them, and, they made a mistake. It doesn't mean that they should be meant to pay for that mistake for the rest of their lives. So the narrative becomes very different. And we're not saying, advocating for Black and Brown youth, I might be straying off a little bit, but I'm just trying to tie it into like how it this idea of forgiveness, which I think is probably the most essential philosophy. But I think that it's got to be somewhere where we're expecting people who commit these kind of violent crimes to be accountable. But there also has to be room for us to be able to forgive them, to be able to give them an opportunity to be reintegrated into society. And that has to do with wraparound supports and getting them to acknowledge their accountability, forgive themselves for their mistakes. And a lot of times when you're talking about from the perspective of the victim, it's not, that aspect of forgiveness, when we talk to those people, it's this idea of how do you forgive somebody who's perpetuated such a violent crime against you without this idea of, does this person even recognize that they've wronged me? Are they truly sorry for this? And it's one thing that we've learned, that I've definitely learned over the course of working with the organization, is that forgiveness has nothing to do with the other person. This idea of being able to forgive someone doesn't mean that you're absolving them of accountability. It doesn't mean that you're not acknowledging being angry for having been suffered at the hands of this person. But what it does is it is really about taking back your power to be able to say, listen, I recognize the humanity in you. We also have a very, philosophy that says hurt people hurt people. Everybody is, the chances of somebody who is perpetuating violence against somebody else having suffered violence is very high, and you don't know what drives people to make the decisions that they do. So I think this whole idea, our organization is called the Forgiveness Project, and it encompasses not just people who have their beliefs rooted in faith, but also people like myself who have their beliefs rooted in, the idea of everybody deserves an opportunity to be held accountable, pay their debt to society, be provided support in order to transform, like real, definitive, tangible support to be able to reintegrate themselves into society. So that's kind of in a nutshell the work that I do. I would also add that, one of the challenges of the work that we do is when we're talking about how we fund ourselves or how we are able to maintain ourselves as an organization, there becomes this idea of, in Toronto, I don't know where anybody else is from, in Canada, we do have a system where we get grants and we're able to sustain ourselves through grants, but a lot of those grants are very short term and they're not really, they don't really provide the opportunity for us to get in-depth over the long-term, like transformational change of these communities that it really requires. So we, it is important for us to address the generational needs, getting to the core issues that are affecting the young people that are putting them on this violent path, which is poverty, lack of access to education, health services, mental health. Like these are the reoccurring problems that a lot of these people are dealing with in these communities. And we think that the structure that is required by, fulfilling these grants prevents us from doing a lot of the work, which I think it's important for organizations. Not one organization has the all-encompassing solution. We're all part of an all-encompassing solution. So it's these kind of conversations and these kind of connections that we have to engage in so that we can all contribute to be a part of the whole solution. And the structure, the lack of structure of the people that we're working with in their lives requires us to be fluid in the way that we approach how we advocate for young people in these situations. So I'm hoping you see the tie-in to the main topic of the discussion, but that's kind of in a nutshell some of the work that we're involved with.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pitt and Ms. Williams for highlighting the importance of your organizations. I think that the common theme that drives the work that we're doing on this topic in particular is the fact that there's underlying principles that if we highlight and center our work, we're able to really address the fundamental needs and requirements of changing individuals in societies, especially in these very troubled situations. One thing you both mentioned is the idea of healing, like what causes true transformation. And that requires a setting of hope and forgiveness and allowing people to move beyond the worst thing they have done, because we're all never the worst thing we have done in life. There's so many things that add to who we are as people. And I think both of the models that you just presented highlighted the fact that we should allow people to move through our stages and not just discard people when they do something that is against the grain. One thing you also mentioned is the need of community in serving the most vulnerable members of our societies. And I want now to turn to this idea of what is the role of community in providing healing and spaces for the people that you both serve in your programs.
You go ahead. Yeah, you please go ahead.
Now, just saying, Solitair, you can start and then kick it off to Ms. Williams.
Okay, cool. I mean, it's invaluable. The community, it's impossible for the work that we do if we do not have the support of the community and the trust of the community and the trust of the young people that we're advocating for. It doesn't work because it's the community that has to be willing to accept these people for the mistakes that they've made and be able to look beyond them as just being, the sum of your crime. Like, oh, you sold drugs or you committed assault. And I think addressing this idea of sexual assault and physical abuse of partners, of women is a very difficult, situation. And as a man, I can't speak to what that, how it is to navigate that kind of trauma. But I think that facing it with a community that is understanding of both the victim and understanding of, as horrible as the crime is, that, like for his situation with Tara, I'm speaking, with her permission. Her story is definitely documented up here. But, in the case of her, her abuser, she later found out that he was also abused. So it's this whole idea of being empathetic towards people's circumstances that they're dealing with that we may not be aware of. Not taking away, again, like people talk about forgiveness as this, we're absolving you, you're forgiving you of this mistake, forgive and forget. No, we're not at all. It's not at all about forgiving and forgetting. It's forgiving and remembering, because remembering is also protecting yourself as well. So you're not reliving that same trauma. And it's not saying that this person who's done this shouldn't be held accountable. They should be held accountable. That's part of the conversation. I mean, just that we're kind of moving into restorative justice kind of conversations where you're actually coming together as the victim and the perpetrator to figure out what's the best way forward where everybody gets to heal. Because, throwing somebody in jail for their crimes, but not helping them to navigate that healing in order to become a more productive member of society once they get, once they return to this society, we're doing everybody an injustice. So community, long and the short of it, is integral to this process.
Thank you so much.
Very much. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Solitair, for your profound wisdom and insight on this topic. And I love the way this conversation is going from the perspective of we've always talked about the victim, the survivor, which are very, very important parts of this conversation. But what I love about this conversation is that there's something that we sometimes allow to fall through the cracks, and that is what about the harm doer? And so I feel like this conversation is thinking about how do we heal those persons that are the harm doers, so that that harm doesn't come to others, so that abuse doesn't come to others. And this idea of the community being a part of that, especially in Black and Brown communities where historically the church or the religious institutions tend to be those spaces where community gathers. Those are the spaces where I really believe that the community, when the community, and specifically I speak of the religious community, when they don't have a healthy theology of abuse, then it's harmful to those victims and survivors who are told to just forgive and forget. But what if we dove into the complexity of what it means to forgive, if we apply that to doctrines of for instance, divorce, and don't send abused women back into abusive situations that become homicidal and sometimes murder-suicidal? What happens when the community wants to protect that favored individual who's such a charismatic leader, and he could not have possibly abused a person in this way, but then the community surrounds him or her, the harm doer, and doesn't allow them to enter that space of condemnation and shame that will bring them to loneliness and repentance, that space that will bring them to loneliness and change. And so I think the community has a really profound impact on what it means for individuals to be brought to places of safety and justice. And from a biblical context, I think about King David and his daughter Tamar being raped by her brother. And David's response was a response of silence. And so here's David being, King David being silent because this son of his was next in line to lead and to rule the kingdom. And so I dare not speak against my son who's going to take the crown. He's the favored leader. He's the next in line. How do I bring him down to shame? And so in that context, Tamar, the abused, lived the rest of her life in desolation, and her other brother ended up killing her harm doer because of the rage and the anger that he contained. And so when we think about repositioning theologies of abuse and how we as a community sometimes surround and protect and don't allow that beloved individual to stand in shame and name what they've done honestly and in integrity, I think we invite them to do it again. I think we affirm them and that we say that it's okay. So I think the role of the community is profound and integrates itself in many ways as we think about bringing victims and survivors to safety and justice.
Thank you very, very much for your thoughts. Ideally, the role of the community is very integral in creating healing spaces, not just only for the survivors, but the responsible party, because we want to create systems in which there's a role for the individual, there's a role for the community, and there's a role for institutions, and all converging to provide spaces that offer true transformation and growth so that we move beyond troubled situations. And I want to move now into, and I want to invite the audience who's tuning in to submit some questions so we can get to them at the end of our conversation today. But I want to move into, what has been the responses of the participants in both of your programs. I invited Mr. Pitt to join this conversation because when I remember that when I listened to one of his presentations, I witnessed this very profound moment in which an audience member, a Caucasian man, asked one of the presenters who was African-American, we were talking about forgiveness, and he said, the audience member asked the participant, he said, we speak about forgiveness, but have you forgiven society for what society has done to you in terms of racism and access? And that was so profound. And the participants said, yes, I did. And I had to, in order for me to move beyond this hate and rage and move into a more healing space for me to become much more productive to society. So in that vein, I would like for you all to discuss the impact of your programs on the participants that you serve, and any highlights or statistics or data that you want to present at this time.
Okay, cool. Probably the artist in me is very averse to like data and statistics. we do have it. I mean, I'm very, very blessed to work with some incredible women in this organization who their attention to detail in terms of keeping track of the work and keeping track of the data and getting feedback from the programs that we do. So we do have that, but I don't, I think I'm a doer in that sense. And I think I'll tell you the most profound compliment that I've gotten from the jail program doing the work is thank you for showing up. Thank you for acknowledging that I have a valid perspective in spite of what I may have done on the outside. When we run these programs, we're in a room. I mean, we haven't been able to go back there since the lockdown, which has been a difficult situation in and of itself. But, when we run these programs, it's often like 15 to 20 men, sweaty, smelly inmates in a room, having conversations about life, about music, about relationships, about what's going on in society. And they're offering opinions and they're offering insights that are brilliant, that would never really be heard by anybody or given any credence strictly because they're marked with this offense of, violent crime or, weapons charges. But these are brilliant young men who have something to offer if you give them that power and that self-worth of saying, listen, I did make a mistake. I deserve to be held accountable, but other things are possible if I'm able to change that perspective on myself. And a lot of that, when you're in those circumstances, when you come from those communities, it's hard to see anything any other way, because that's a big part of who you are. So it's important for us to come into this space to say, listen, I see you. I know you've made a mistake. I don't even know what it is, but I'm showing you that I can see the value of who you are as an individual. If you can recognize your power to change your circumstances, it's going to be hard. It's going to be impossible. And we always say, it's like, everybody in this room may not be ready to receive this message, but when you do, we'll be here. So it's really just showing up and treating people like human beings who've made a mistake, like we all have. It's some of the people that have come up to me and given me compliments. I don't want to run on too long, but it was there are guys who would come in and their face would be blank. They wouldn't say anything. They wouldn't nod their head. They wouldn't participate, but they came back every week. And then after 5 weeks, I'm in there and I'm, in addition to doing group programs, I also do one-on-one support while just talking, especially a lot of the young men I work with are aspiring artists. So I'll just answer questions about, the industry or how did they get started. And so one day I'm leaving, with one of the young men that I mentor, and the same participant who had this ice grill on his face the whole time. He's like, yo, let me talk to you for a second. I'm like, well, wow. I don't even think I've heard the sound of his voice before. And he's like, yo, I just want to let you know that I appreciate you guys showing up. You guys don't have to come and do this. And I see you, and, I don't really participate because I think a lot of the guys in there aren't really being genuine. They're kind of just saying what they think sounds good because it will help them with their charges or whatever. But, there are a lot of guys in there who see what you're doing and they value what you're doing and keep it up. And I think that people think that it is hard work. It is challenging work. It is long hours. It is very depleting in terms of your energy and your spirit, but it really doesn't take much more than showing up and showing empathy and showing these people that you are not the sum of your mistakes. There is more to you if you are willing and to explore that. And there are people out there who will accept that from you. You just got to you have to find that. And I think it's important for us as workers to connect, to support each other, whether it's like cross international boundaries, like, Canada, the US, or whether it's communities across the city, and that's one of the things that we've been trying to kind of build, this network. So it's not one community organization isolated trying to address that problem, when it's a problem that everybody else is facing, and we can create a stronger response if we're all networked and working in coordination with each other.
And I would just add briefly to what Solitair just named. When I think about this question of participants' response or experiences, the word that comes to me is perspective. And I think when we move along society, there are cultural understandings that we carry with us. And I think a religious perspective or understanding is you forgive and you forget. I think it's a pretty synonymous language of what it means to forgive. And so I think that being engaged with and becoming aware of a forgiveness model like the one I described, just the awareness and the perspective is like, whoa, my theology offers me another option that I never even considered. And I think very simply for our participants, that perspective gives them a new way to understand how to forgive. For many who may be very guilty, like in my heart, I don't trust that person. I don't feel like I can forgive them. I think it helps for some of our people. It just helps release some of that guilt that guilt and feeling like, oh, I can't, I'm confusing forgiveness with reconciliation and restoration of relationship. So that maybe I've done the psychological forgiveness. Maybe I've prayed for the healing and transformation of my abuser in time. But then maybe it's not possible for me to get to reconciliation, to get to restoration of relationship, and I never considered that. My forgiveness can be full without it. And so I think for our people, just perspective of like, whoa, you just expanded the playing field and expanded my awareness of what forgiveness means and how I'm living that out in my reality as I move toward becoming whole.
Yes.
Thank you very much. The chat is on fire. There are so many resources being posted in the chat, which we're going to send via email as well.
Amazing.
But at this point, I'm going to ask a few questions from the audience. This one is a really one to really think about. Mr. Gorman asks, how can an individual forgive a whole society? And that might be in reference to what I just mentioned. And I also want to read one other question, and then Mr. Pitt and Ms. Williams, you could take whatever questions you want to take at this time. The question from Emily reads, how do we as communities and individuals create a space where folks who harm others are more likely to comprehend their wrongs rather than maintaining the entitled belief that led them to abuse in the first place? So how do we create these spaces for accountability, and how do you even forgive a whole society for the harms that they have done to you? Any thoughts that come to mind?
I think about one other product of our advocacy for victims of abuse program is that one of our desires is to create healing space, safe sanctuaries, so that our sanctuaries are identified as these spaces where those who are abused or victim survivors, those individuals can expect to come into that space. And when they hear messages from the pulpit, they're expected that that those are sermons, for an example, that have trauma-informed language. They have pastors that are aware of the doctrines of the faith, like, for instance, divorce. But then we can add a nuance when we talk about abuse. So safe and healing sanctuaries are these spaces where victim survivors can come and expect that this is a safe space for me as an abused person. And so I think in an extension of that, which we've not done, but I love this question, I think an extension of that could be, what might it look like to create safe sanctuary for individuals who are harm doers. And I think thus far in our victim and abuse programs, we've mostly focused and centered on the abused and the survivors. But what might it look like to create a similar space that focuses on transformation, really transformation and growth for the harm doer, so that a harm doer can come in that same space and realize that it's a space that's non-judgmental space, but that is a space where they will be held accountable and where there's a community that's present for them to live into that accountability, to be transformed.
Yeah, I agree. Well said. I think having witnessed our executive director, Tara Muldoon, and her ability to be able to forgive her assaulter, it's this idea of, we can either, as heinous as the crime is, I think these are as they say, the difficult and uncomfortable conversation that we have to have, because if we're trying to institute change behavior, we have to provide incentives, and it can't just be punitive, because our natural response to being punished is to most people will try to do what they can, depending on what level the crime is or whatever. Sometimes it's, for most of us, it's pretty benign stuff that we just don't want to get in trouble for. But the idea of you're going to do everything you can to absolve yourself of being held accountable. But if we're able to, as you said, provide this safe space where we're like, number one thing that we must demand is accountability. It can't be a situation where you're just expected to, okay, you apologize and then you move on. No, there has to be some accountability, and we can't discount that. But we also have to create a space to say, listen, if you're willing to be a part of this process to help make changes for yourself where you will benefit, we will benefit as a community, and we can find a way to have this conversation to help everybody heal. Because, the unpopular perspective is that criminals need healing. A lot of them are very broken individuals. Nobody's born a criminal. That's another conversation that we have. Nobody's born with this, this propensity to commit violence against others. It's usually something that's a learned behavior based on experiences or what have you, or situations. So we have to provide spaces to have challenging conversations. Restorative justice is one of those, controversial ways where we can begin to create a space where to facilitate those difficult conversations. But until we have it in a meaningful way, there's not really a productive approach to reintegrating somebody, especially when you're talking about domestic violence and situations like that.
One, I know we're coming up on time, but let me just add as a resource for the individual to ask the question. I think about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that comes out of South Africa. Bishop Desmond Tutu was one of the leaders of that project. And that was a project that emerged from apartheid in South Africa. But it's a restorative justice practice where individuals who very specifically caused harm to an individual would have to confront the individual that they caused the harm to. They named what they did. The individual that was harmed would say how what was done affected them, and then the harm doer would name, and this is before a community of people where there's accountability established, they would name what it is that they would do to restore what was broken. And so for those looking for a model for something like that, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission out of South Africa, if you just Google that, it might stir some ideas.
Fantastic. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, our time is up. This was a wonderful conversation. I hope that we all find spaces whereby we could continue this conversation in our own spaces, in our faith communities, in our secular communities, so that we could advance the movement towards creating systems, newer systems that really speaks to transforming individuals as opposed to casting them away, which is not something that we want to do. So I hope that this conversation sparks some insights and we all create continued spaces to learn and grow. All the information in the chats, we're going to post it via email. This recording would be up online for further discussions and further listening if you all want to do so. And I want to thank the panelists. I'm really amazed by the work that you were doing. I've seen the impact on the participants, and I just wish you all the best as you continue forging this new path towards truly transforming individuals' lives. So thank you all so much. I really, really appreciate your time today. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Take care. Great to share conversational space with you guys. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Thank you. Bye.